Welcome to my April essay. This one is part 2 of Circus and Physical Literacy called Teach Physical Literacy We Must. So last month, I did part 1, which was a deep dive into physical literacy and unpacking the way that we can physically read or write in an environment. You should go back and check out that essay if you haven't yet, but the quick synopsis is the parts of our environment that draw our attention and that the actions that we have available to us, the movements we have available to us, influence how we interact with the whole world around us. There's a critical difference between thinking of physical literacy as a benchmark, like can I do whatever skill, and thinking of physical literacy as a process, a literacy process, like what information do I recognize in the world around me and how do I react to it? More importantly, which of these definitions does movement culture bend towards? In my experience, it tends to bend more towards the benchmark definition, the can I do this skill? And can we as movement teachers push back against this benchmark definition and favor teaching a more process-oriented definition? I left off last month by acknowledging that this process-oriented definition of physical literacy can create richer experiences and more independent students. And I use circus education to help illustrate this. To be clear, there's nothing inherently great about circus education. Circus education can fall into the same just learn the moves trap as sports education or dance education. Likewise, sports and dance education can be excellent tools for building a physical literacy process orientation. In sports specifically, they're non-aesthetic, so it doesn't matter how you look when you kick the ball. They're very task-oriented, and this can be a really good and powerful thing. But for the rest of this essay, I'm going to focus on how circus education gives us some clear illustrations of features that relate to physical literacy and how we can use those features to enrich other forms of movement learning. Circus can be a great environment for some of these features, but there's no reason that they can't be incorporated into other forms of movement teaching, like pole or dance or acrobatics or whatever. The first of these features I call creation rather than imitation. The creation of new movements rather than imitation of movement templates is at the root of circus practice. This practice develops two different skills in students, the skill of reading familiar environments or props in unfamiliar ways, and the skill of writing unfamiliar solutions onto those creative problems. In movement disciplines like dance, yoga, or sports, there's a really strong social pressure to execute a pose in a certain way, or to do a pirouette using a certain technique, or to shoot a basketball just like this. Other ways of accomplishing these movements are quote-unquote wrong, and if you do them wrong, they can result in correction or ridicule, especially while you're still learning the movements. Many circus disciplines are definitely getting pulled in this direction, especially in aerial arts. Less and less focus on invention and more focus on imitation. Rather than teaching the fundamentals to our students and leaving the rest for them to invent, we have a tendency to teach just the latest trick or to teach a sequence or a trick that looks really good. I think this tendency emerges from a larger cultural trend. Students want a recordable moment rather than a messy, inventive process. We, as coaches, have to do a better job at pushing back against this by asking, what is the underlying experiment that led to this new skill or transition or trick? How can we replicate the experiment and not just the results of the experiment? I think it's easy to cast ourselves as passive servants at the whim of our paying students, but I think that's a disservice both to ourselves as teachers and coaches and to the traditions and disciplines that we represent. To be clear, I think it's really brilliant to have a student invent or reinvent something that already exists. The point is that we have to practice this as a process, and arriving at an answer that's already known is super valuable. Circus disciplines don't emphasize this creation or invention process inherently, but the circus is pretty popularly known or well known for presenting something that is awesome or unusual or unfamiliar. In dance or in sport, most students have some exposure to what something is supposed to look like, and so they'll shy away from experimenting outside of that mold. Circus presents us an opportunity to change that, but we, as teachers and coaches, have to really seize on that opportunity. I like to use something a little unusual like circus bicycling. If you go to the essay, you'll see a link to some cool videos as a good example of this, because it really reveals that the circus way isn't about a specific circus discipline. It's about a way of approaching familiar things, like a bicycle, in unfamiliar ways. Can I ride it backward? Can I ride it standing? Can I ride it pedaling with my hands? A lot of movement teaching doesn't ask these questions and instead just favors teaching a set of skills. On the whole, I think that's a loss, and what we have to learn from circus isn't about the specific circus skills, but about an approach to familiar objects in unfamiliar ways. The second feature I want to talk about is multidisciplinary classes or multidisciplinary spaces. Circus justifiably houses a lot of different movement disciplines in a single facility, or sometimes even within a single class. The preconception that we have of circus, that it includes many disciplines, is so strong that a lot of monodisciplinary spaces won't identify themselves as circus schools. In my experience, this is actually the primary divide between, quote, circus education and, say, aerial arts education or acrobatics education. Spaces that identify as circus will offer multiple disciplines, and those multiple disciplines usually include some access to disciplines like object manipulation, juggling, or balance. Now, circus spaces certainly aren't the only places where you see this. In the pole community, for example, lots of spaces will include pole, but also lyra, or also handstands, or also contortion, and they won't necessarily identify as circus. Ninja warrior or movement spaces will also include things like slack lines, gymnastics equipment, or climbing walls, and sometimes even aerial apparatuses. All of this is like a really super good thing, because multidisciplinarianism in a single space is a powerful tool for physical literacy development. Having easy access to multiple disciplines in a single space develops what I call type comparison instead of hierarchical comparison. For example, Sally is different than Bob. Sally might be better at juggling and Bob might be better at trapeze. But if there's only trapeze in our space or only juggling in our space, then either Sally or Bob is going to be better at the one thing that this space offers. Different movement disciplines are also a bit like different languages. Each one has inherent biases and structures that aren't necessarily clear until you've learned a different movement discipline. Being literate in multiple disciplines allows students to see a richer, deeper world around them and allows them to write more broadly onto that world. Juggling is a great example. Forming some skill with the pattern making inherent in juggling allows you to begin to see those patterns in the world all around you and to organize other movement disciplines into similar patterns of exchange. I want to hold a special thing about this multidisciplinarism for a moment. The first thing I want to hold, and these things kind of contradict each other, is that firstly, it's really important to have people have some freedom to pursue the things they enjoy most. I'm not really interested in having students practice a movement discipline that they really don't enjoy. Simultaneously, I think it's also really important to recognize that it's human nature to avoid things that we don't think we're good at, even if learning those things could be really valuable for us. So there's a bit of a tension here where I do think it's important for students to be exposed to and to expose themselves to a whole lot of different movement disciplines, and that we as teachers have a role in applying a little bit of gentle pressure to make sure that students do that. At the same time, I don't think it's appropriate to force students to do different things. I think it's more appropriate to kind of like expose students to the idea that exploring different movement disciplines or engaging in movement disciplines that they don't find enjoyable might still have some value. This is why I use what I call casual multidisciplinarism. Instead of forcing multiple disciplines on anyone, I try to just casually make them available or utilize them in my warm-ups, or generally create space and access to as many different disciplines as I can. I think that all classes or schools should have the widest variety of disciplines possible, and that movement teachers themselves should actively pursue multiple movement disciplines. They can exist within a single class or just share space. I think both of those things are really valuable. My easiest possible solution, which is for some reason really deeply unpopular every time I suggest it to teachers, is incorporating hand-eye object drills as part of your warm-up or part of your cool-down. This kind of looks like juggling. Other solutions that I have might include some small partner acrobatic drills or basic acrobatics as a warm-up for aerial classes, or including moving in rhythm or with music as part of any class, including something that introduces people to something other than what they've signed up for, I think is super valuable and important. The final feature I want to talk about is skill progression, or an intrinsic knowledge of success. Intrinsic knowledge of success means a student can tell whether or not they've succeeded without receiving feedback from you or another external force. A simple example might be balancing on an unstable surface. You know that you've succeeded if you don't fall off. A big part of being a movement teacher is framing success for students and trying to select level-appropriate drills or skills that have these easily identifiable intrinsic knowledge of success criteria. Lots of movement disciplines have progressively more complex and difficult moves that contain an intrinsic knowledge of success. But in circus, we have an added benefit. It's easy for students to develop their own drills based on skills that are novel or invented. There are a couple things that I try to think about when I'm thinking about helping students with this progression or with invention or with this sort of intrinsic knowledge of success that we want to develop. First off, whether I'm coaching a specific skill or a student is inventing something, what opportunities for variation exist? And do those variations alter the difficulty or the meaningfulness of the skill? Secondly, if I think the student is succeeding, but the student feels like they're failing, what is missing in either their understanding or mine? If I think the student is having a success, but they think they're having a failure, what am I seeing that they're not? Or vice versa. If I am like, this student is doing very poorly, but they feel like they're succeeding at something, what is missing in my understanding? What am I missing that's making them feel very successful? The progressive nature of circus skills emphasizes this individual sense of achievement, providing opportunities for meaningful experiences of failure, success, frustration, pride. And this develops regulatory skills, resilience, experiential knowledge that persistence leads to growth and change. And it can also help students recognize that being successful and feeling successful aren't always the same thing. To relate this more directly to the development of physical literacy, I'll make an analogy to language. When someone is learning a new language, they'll often mess up on the details, but still accomplish their purpose. The grammatically correct "where is the bathroom" is no more or less useful than the charming "bathroom is where" or the utilitarian "bathroom." As the learner is working on their language skills, the feedback they receive tells them whether or not their communication was successful. But it also becomes obvious to everyone participating in the communication that the rules of grammar are pretty arbitrary. Physical literacy is the same, and circus really encourages this kind of movement disobedience or movement rule breaking in favor of a kind of movement poetry in which students are encouraged to play with the rules of movement grammar. In circus, we create our own criteria for success, much in the same way that a poet might get to follow or break the rules of grammar in order to make a point. To sum it up, these three features, new movement multidisciplinarianism, and the intrinsic knowledge of success are definitely not unique to circus. They're not even necessarily inherent in circus. They're just illustrated really well by circus education. They are important for the development of physical literacy, where circus provides us a good learning ground for practicing these principles in our teaching. As a movement coach, circus helped me to figure out that I should be setting my own criteria for the success of my teaching, rather than evaluating myself based on the technical skill and level of my students. When I started to watch my students for other skills, how quickly do they learn? How creatively do they solve problems? How strong are their social bonds? How readily do they stand up for themselves? That's when I started to realize how transformative movement teaching can really be.